So what we have here is a clamshell lighting setup, a very basic clamshell lighting setup, but a clamshell lighting setup nonetheless. We have a key light that's above, 45 degree down. We have a fill light that's below, 45 degree up, creates that clamshell. Now in the photography space, clamshell lighting is a very accepted way to light your subject. It's often used in beauty lighting. The look that you can get is very pleasing and soft. And so when it comes to this sort of lighting setup, you really don't hear any photographers saying, no, don't light your subject that way. But for some reason, when you replace it and it looks like this, and you have whatever your key light is, but then you have a reflector that's below your subject pointing up, pushing the light underneath, there are some photographers who say, no, don't do that. Don't put your reflector underneath your subject. You're holding the reflector wrong. That's not the right position. And it doesn't seem to make much sense, right? Because clamshell lighting is clamshell lighting. Essentially, when this light is reflecting light from your key, this becomes its own light source in essence, and you still have clamshell lighting. So there's really nothing wrong with holding the reflector this way. But I'm a man that's fair. And the reason why some photographers say that is because there are times when you use a reflector and you're bouncing that light back into your subject. Essentially, the light that's being bounced off of your reflector and filling in those shadows becomes stronger than the light that's coming from your key, whether that's external lighting, the sun, whatever light source it is. When you run into a situation where your bounce light coming from underneath is stronger than your top light, your key light, you get this weird effect. And so that's why some photographers will say, don't do that. And it's understandable because that really isn't a pleasing look. It's not natural. But the thing is, it's not that you shouldn't place your reflector there. You just need to understand where to place your reflector. Now, when you think about bounce light, okay, the distance of the reflector from the light source and the distance of the reflector from your subject will I got caught up there. I know exactly what I want to say, but I got caught up. I'm going to leave that in. It will essentially change the intensity of the light that's making it to your subject, right? So if I have this reflector closer to this light source, obviously I'm going to get stronger light hitting it, which means there's going to be more light that can bounce off of it. Likewise, if I have the reflector way down here, there's not going to be as much light that's making it here. And then not only does the light have to make it down here, but then it has to bounce back in as well. So depending upon your distance, you really can control the amount of light that's being reflected into your subject. So when you're having the reflector down here, it's not that this is the problem. It's just that you really have to control how much light is being bounced back into your subject. Now, when I think about reflectors, and when you think about reflectors, there's really two things that you need to be thinking about first. You need to be thinking about your light source, because a reflector in and of itself is not its own independent light source. It is just bouncing light. So if you take away the light source that is bouncing off of it, it's not still going to be able to emit its own light. So a reflector is not really its own light source. It becomes a light source when it's bouncing light, but it's not independently its own light source. So the first thing you have to think about is, where is your light source? And then the second thing you have to think about is, what are you wanting to do with the light that's being bounced off of your reflector? Are you trying to use it as a key light? Are you trying to fill in shadows? Are you trying to add a second light? So, what are you trying to do with the bounce light? It's very important to think about those two things, because that's essentially going to determine where you place your reflector, the angle, and all of those things. So it's very natural when we're shooting, especially as a one-man band, which a lot of us photographers often are, it's very natural to be shooting and you're just holding the reflector this way. It makes sense. It's pretty easy to do. And for the most part, it can work well. but that may not always be the best place to put it. Sometimes the best place may be to hold it up this way and bounce the light back into your subject this way. Sometimes it may be to hold it overhead this way so that you're having that light bounce back down on your subject. And that would definitely be the case if you had the light source was behind your subject, so you want to bounce that light back in. If you've got the light coming in from this way, wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have the reflector down here, because you have to think about the angle of the light that you're getting. If we have a light source that's coming in straight, okay, see if you can still see this, right? So if you have a light source that's coming in straight, can you see that that's straight? So now that light source is straight, it does me no good to have a reflector like this, right? The light's coming in this way. There's not going to be much light that's bouncing off of this to make it back into the subject. But if that light source is coming this way and I raise it up this way, now we've got the light coming in, and I would even angle it down so that way that light's coming in, it's going to hit and it's going to bounce back into your subject. Likewise, if you have a light source that is higher up and is pointing down, sure, you could do this because you're going to have the light that's going to come this way, it's going to bounce, boom, back in. You can have it this way because you're going to get a little bit of light, it's still going to hit there, bounce back in. To some degree, you kind of can do this. It depends on how big your light source and how strong the light source is, but you really have to think about the angle of your light source and how powerful that light source is, because again, if the light source isn't that powerful, it's got to come from here, it's got to hit the reflector and then bounce back in. Oftentimes with white, you really have to have a pretty strong light source for white to really be effective, or you have to put the reflector very close to the light source and very close to your subject to really get light bounced in. Now, if you're using the silver, this is gold, but if you were using the silver side, then you get a little bit more power because silver and gold, but don't use gold. But silver is more reflective. So you're going to get a little bit more power. Typically, you kind of get like a stop or two extra of your light from bouncing it off of silver than you would white. Of course, your silver is going to be more specular, but you get more power that way. So you have to think about the angle. That really is going to dictate where you place your reflector. Now, a lot of times on cloudy days, you'll see people using reflectors to fill in the shadows, because although clouds are like the sun's softbox, so it produces this very soft quality of light, the light is actually not that powerful. So you don't get as much bounce from a reflector as you may think. Now, it will help to fill in the shadows a little bit if you have the reflector pretty close to your subject, but you don't really have a lot of flexibility with reflectors on cloudy days, because although the light seems bright, it's not that strong. It is bright per se, perceptionally, but the light is really not that strong. So to be able to have the light coming, hitting a reflector and then bouncing back in, especially if you're using white, you really have to get that modifier in there for it to be effective. So the point of this video that I want to drive home is that when it comes to reflectors, there's no wrong way to place the reflector, but there's not necessarily a right way either. It really has to do with, again, your light source that you're trying to reflect and how powerful that light source is. And when you think about those two things, and then you add in what you're trying to do or get from the reflected light, that will help you determine where you want to place your reflector. So if it makes sense to have it underneath your subject at like a clamshell setup, that's totally fine. Do not let any photographer tell you that you can, because you can. It's totally fine. If you again, you have backlit situation, you want to have it like this or like this, great, that works. When I use reflectors, I typically like to try to use it this way or this way, mainly because I want a more natural light hitting my subject. So it's not just about filling in the shadows. It is nice sometimes to hold it this way and you do get those shadows filled in, but I would rather have the shadows filled in more naturally, right? Because if I have a light source that's high, that's naturally going to create shadows, I don't really want to work against those shadows. I want to work with them. I don't want them to be as deep and as dark, but I don't necessarily want to fill them in in the opposite direction of how they're cast. I've placed my light in a certain way to be able to get that shadow pattern. I don't really want to work against that. So I typically will try to have a reflector that's more this way or up, so that way I'm getting more of a natural feel and I'm not really messing with the shadows in terms of the direction. But that's just me and a personal preference. Definitely doesn't matter. If you want to hold it like that, you can. If you want to do it like this, you can. At the end of the day, you just have to know what you're trying to do, and whatever it is you're trying to do, you do what you have to do to get the look that you want.